I work the graveyard shift at a central emergency dispatch center. The hours between midnight and 6 in the morning do something terrible to the human mind. The rest of the world goes to sleep, and you are left sitting in a dark, heavily air-conditioned room, staring at a bank of glowing monitors, listening to the worst moments of people's lives. You deal with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, medical emergencies, and the deeply lonely people who just want to hear a voice in the dark. You learn to detach yourself, to follow the strict protocols established by the city. My training was brief. The supervisor handed me a thick binder of codes, showed me how to log into the routing software, and pointed me to a desk in the back corner of the room. The dispatcher who worked this desk before me had quit without giving any notice. He simply walked out in the middle of a Tuesday night shift and never came back. No one in the office liked to talk about him. When I sat down at the desk for the first time, I found a small yellow sticky note pressed firmly onto the lower bezel of the primary monitor. The handwriting was frantic. The letters pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through. The note contained a single, highly specific rule. If a caller speaks an undocumented, clicking dialect and asks for a translator, transfer them to line 9 and hang up immediately. I stared at the note for a long time. Dispatch centers receive calls from people speaking hundreds of different languages. We have an entire department dedicated to rapid translation services, transferring a desperate caller to a dead line and terminating the connection goes against every single ethical and professional regulation in the manual. I assumed the note was a dark, twisted joke, left by an employee who had burned out from the stress of the job. I peeled the sticky note off the monitor and tossed it into the trash can under my desk. I worked the desk for 3 weeks without incident. The calls were routine. I drank terrible coffee, rooted ambulances, and watched the clock slowly tick toward morning. The call came in on a Thursday night at exactly 3 in the morning. The digital console beeped sharply. I pressed the button on my headset. 911, what is your emergency? The line was completely silent for a moment. No heavy breathing, no background traffic, no wind. The audio feed sounded incredibly sterile. Then, the clicking started. It was a rapid, rhythmic sequence of hard, wet sounds. It sounded exactly like wet tissue, striking the back of a pallet, mixed with the sharp scraping of stones rubbing together. The clicks varied in pitch and speed, forming a complex, structured cadence that clearly functioned as a spoken language. I had handled calls involving rare dialects before, but this audio profile was entirely alien. It made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I cannot understand you. Do you need police, fire, or medical assistance?" The clicking paused. A deep, heavily distorted voice spoke through the static. The voice sounded incredibly unnatural, as if multiple vocal cords were vibrating simultaneously. To produce the English words, "Translator," the voice rasped, the syllables dragging across the connection. "We need a translator." A sharp jolt of adrenaline flooded my chest. I immediately remembered the crumpled yellow sticky note, sitting at the bottom of my trash can. I moved my mouse across the screen, hovering the cursor over line 9. My finger rested on the left mouse button. I was entirely prepared to click and end the call before I could press the button. A new sound bled through the audio feed. It was a child, a young boy, crying softly in the background. His voice was incredibly clear, completely lacking the distortion of the primary caller. "Please," the child sobbed, his voice trembling with genuine terror. "Please help us. He is hurting my mom. I want to go home." My hand froze over the mouse. The professional detachment I relied on to survive the job completely evaporated. You cannot ignore a child in danger. I pulled my hand away from the mouse and brought my fingers to the keyboard. "I hear you," I said urgently. "I am staying on the line. Can you tell me where you are?" The child did not answer. The deep, distorted voice returned to the channel, completely speaking over the crying boy. "You stayed," the voice whispered. The clicking sounds erupted again, significantly louder and more aggressive this time, drowning out the background noise entirely. The wet, scraping blasted through my headset, vibrating painfully against my eardrums. I stared at the location software on my monitor. The map was attempting to lock onto the signal, but the tracking radius was completely malfunctioning. The red perimeter circle bounced wildly across the city grid, stretching from the downtown all the way to the borders, entirely unable to pinpoint a stable coordinate. "Sir, you need to tell me your location. I'm dispatching units, but I need an address." The static on the line spiked violently, producing a sharp, deafening screech of audio feedback. I ripped the headset off my ears and threw it onto the desk. The call abruptly disconnected. I tried to pull the archived call data to force a manual location trace, but the system registered the interaction as a corrupted file. There was no phone number attached to the record. There was no digital footprint. It was as if the call had never actually occurred. I finished the remainder of my shift in a state of profound, lingering unease. I kept staring at the blank screen, waiting for the phone to ring again, but the console remained quiet. When 6 o'clock finally arrived, I gathered my belongings, clocked out, and walked to my car in the empty parking lot. The environment of my daily life began to severely deteriorate. That same evening, I live alone in a small ground-floor apartment on the outskirts of the city. I went home, locked the deadbolts, and tried to sleep. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, completely unable to settle my mind. At roughly 2 in the afternoon, the ambient noise in my bedroom completely shifted. The low hum of the air conditioning stopped. The distant sound of traffic faded entirely into silence. A sharp, wet sound echoed from the dark hallway outside my bedroom door. It was the clicking, the exact same rapid sequence of scraping stones and wet tissue I had heard through the headset at the dispatch center, but it came from inside my home. I sat up slowly, pushing the blankets off my chest. I reached out to the bedside table and grabbed the flashlight. I engaged the beam, aiming the bright circle of light directly toward the open bedroom door. The hallway was filled with thick, unnatural shadows that seemed to actively resist the illumination of the flashlight. Something was shifting along the wall, just outside my vision. I gripped the flashlight tightly and took a slow step toward the door. The thing occupying my hallway completely defied any logical biological structure. It was a massive, chaotic amalgamation of human anatomy and debris, crawling slowly across the hardwood floorboards. The body of it consisted entirely of dozens of severed, heavily bruised human limbs, arms and legs, brutally fused together in a shifting, rolling mass of rotting, discolored flesh, wrapped aggressively around the bruised limbs. Binding the horrific anatomy together were hundreds of yards of thick, unspooled copper telephone wire. The frayed, rusted copper dug deeply into the flesh, creating deep lacerations that wept a dark, thick fluid onto my floorboards. Spread randomly across the shifting mass were multiple human mouths, simply torn, ragged lips and teeth, embedded directly into the bruised skin. Every single mouth was opening and closing in perfect unison, producing the deafening, rapid clicking dialect. I stood completely paralyzed in the doorway, my mind aggressively rejecting what I was seeing. The creature slowly oriented its massive, rolling bulk directly toward my position. The copper wires scraped violently against the floorboards as it pulled itself forward. My survival instinct finally shattered the paralysis. I threw the flashlight directly at the shifting mass of limbs. It struck the creature, producing a sharp, wet thud, and rolled away into the dark. I turned around, sprinted blindly toward the bedroom window, unlatched the glass pane, and threw myself completely out of the ground floor opening. I hit the landscaping bushes outside, scrambled frantically to my feet, and ran down the street until my lungs burned, and my legs threatened to collapse. I spent the rest of the day sitting in the back corner of a crowded diner, drinking endless cups of black coffee, entirely terrified to return to my apartment. I knew I could not simply run away. That thing was tied to the call I stayed in. I needed to understand what happened, and what that note really meant. I waited until the sun went down and drove back to the dispatch center. I used my employee access card to enter the building before my shift began. I sat at my desk, bypassed the standard routing software, and dug into the raw diagnostic data of the server archives. I pulled the corrupted file from the previous night. I ran a manual decryption protocol, stripping away the audio files to isolate the raw geographical data points the tower had attempted to lock onto before the system crashed. The software spit out a single, heavily fragmented set of coordinates. The location was situated deep within the abandoned industrial sector, on the extreme eastern edge of the city, an area completely devoid of residential housing or active commercial businesses. I printed the coordinates, locked my workstation, and walked back out to my car. I retrieved a heavy tire iron from the trunk, placed it on the passenger seat, and drove toward the eastern sector. I followed the GPS coordinates until I reached a dead end at the edge of a massive, sprawling complex. The faded, rusted metal sign hanging over the main loading dock indicated the building was formerly a meatpacking plant. The structure was immense, easily spanning an entire city block, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with coils of rusted razor wire. I parked in an overgrown alleyway, grabbed the tire iron, and approached the perimeter fence. I found a section where the chain link had been violently peeled back, creating a narrow gap large enough to crawl through. I stepped inside the plant. Hundreds of heavy steel meat hooks hung from an intricate network of rusted rails bolted to the ceiling. The hooks swung slightly in the draft, clinking together with a metallic chime. I walked slowly across the processing floor, keeping my grip tight on the tire iron. As I reached the far end of the facility, my flashlight beam illuminated a structure that completely defied the abandoned nature of the plant. Built directly into the center of a massive, empty storage locker was a small, self-contained room, constructed from heavy cinder blocks. The steel door securing the room was pristine, lacking any rust, and locked with a heavy, modern brass padlock. Someone was actively using this room. I wedged the flat edge of the tire iron beneath the padlock and applied my entire body weight to the metal bar. The locking mechanism fought back for a moment, before the metal casing violently snapped. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The space was heavily insulated with thick layers of acoustic foam. A single, bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh, yellow glare across the room. Positioned in the corner was a large plastic bin, overflowing with hundreds of personal documents, foreign passports, temporary work visas, international identification cards. I looked closely at the photographs. A profound, sickening wave of recognition washed over me. I had seen these faces before. They were the faces of undocumented immigrants who had vanished entirely from the city over the past decade. Resting on a wooden desk next to the bin were neat, organized stacks of folded clothing. The garments were heavily stained, with large, dark patches of dried blood. Sitting on the opposite end of the desk was a small, boxy television set, connected to a dusty DVD player and a VCR. I grabbed the tape sitting at the top of the stack, pushed the plastic cassette into the VCR, and pressed play. The screen flared with white static before stabilizing into a grainy, low-resolution video feed. Sitting comfortably in a folding metal chair was a man, late 60s, short, neatly trimmed gray hair, a stern, weathered face. He looked directly into the camera lens, his expression entirely calm and devoid of any human empathy. "The system is entirely broken." The man spoke, his voice deep, authoritative, and chillingly articulate. "The politicians open the gates and allow the filth to flood our streets. The official channels refuse to take the necessary action. If the government refuses to take out the trash, the responsibility falls to the patriots. I spent 30 years patrolling the checkpoints. I know how they cross, I know where they gather, I offer them a ride. False promises of expedited citizenship paperwork, so they climb into the back of the van willingly. They are desperate, trusting animals. I bring them here to clear the world of the infection." He slowly turned his head, looking down at the bound woman weeping on the floor. Before turning his gaze back to the camera, he reached down out of the frame, lifting a heavy steel meat cleaver into view, and stood up from the chair. I violently slammed my hand against the power button, killing the video feed. I backed away from the desk, my entire body shaking with horror. The scale of the violence was completely incomprehensible. I frantically began searching the wooden desk, pulling open the heavy drawers, desperate to find any identifying information. Inside the bottom drawer, resting on a bed of velvet, was a wooden shadow box. The box contained the retired officer's official badges, commendation medals, and an engraved brass plaque detailing his 30 years of service. Tucked neatly beneath the brass plaque was a recent utility bill. The document bore the man's full legal name and a residential address. Located in a manicured suburban neighborhood on the western edge of the city, I memorized the address and shoved the utility bill deep into my pocket. I needed to call the federal authorities, so I got my phone and called the police. But all I heard on the other side was the clicking sound. I turned away from the desk, reaching for my tire iron. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling violently flickered and shattered. The room plunged into darkness. The temperature aggressively plummeted, turning my exhaled breath into a white vapor. From the cavernous darkness of the main processing floor, a sharp, wet sound echoed loudly against the concrete. Click, click, click. The thing had found me. The rapid sound of wet tissue and scraping stones multiplied rapidly, echoing off the rusted meat hooks and the high ceiling. I grabbed the tire iron, engaged the flashlight, and sprinted out of the cinderblock room. Dropping aggressively down from the high, rusted rails above was the entity. The massive amalgamation of bruised, severed limbs hit the floor with a sickening thud. The copper telephone wires binding the flesh whipped violently through the air, striking the metal pillars and sending sparks showering across the room. Dozens of jagged mouths opened simultaneously, producing a deafening, overlapping roar of the clicking dialect. The creature pulled its shifting mass forward, moving with a terrifying speed, blocking the main corridor leading back to the loading dock. I sprinted in the opposite direction, tearing wildly through the maze of lockers. The creature pursued me relentlessly, tearing down rusted shelving units and smashing through the rubber doors. I navigated the dark, labyrinthine plant purely on adrenaline, utilizing the narrow gaps between the heavy machinery to slow the massive bulk of the creature. I breached the final processing room, diving frantically under a rusted steel sorting gate, just as a thick loop of copper wire whipped aggressively through the air, entirely shattering the concrete wall directly behind my head. I scrambled to my feet, burst through the side pedestrian door, and threw myself out into the cold night air. I ran to my car, practically tearing the door handle off, and threw myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the transmission into gear and tore out of the place, my chest heaving violently as I watched the dark silhouette of the meatpacking plant fade in the rearview mirror. I parked miles away, staring blankly at the steering wheel. I was safe for the moment. But the fundamental reality of the situation remained. Calling the federal authorities to arrest the retired officer would not save my life. The authorities could lock the killer in a concrete cell, but they could not arrest the creature. The creature was entirely bound to me. It would relentlessly hunt me down. Wherever I went, a desperate, highly dangerous plan rapidly formed in my mind. If the creature targeted the person on the other end of the line, I simply needed to manipulate the connection. I drove across the city, entering the quiet, perfectly manicured streets of the western suburbs. I parked 2 blocks away from the residential address on the utility bill. The neighborhood was completely silent. The large homes sitting comfortably behind perfectly trimmed hedges and expensive wrought iron fences. I walked quietly down the sidewalk until I found the correct house. A pristine 2-story brick home, a manicured front lawn, a large bay window, the lights on the ground floor, actively burning, cutting brightly through the dark night. I approached the front porch, took a deep, steadying breath, and rang the doorbell. I waited for nearly a minute before the oak door slowly opened. Standing in the entryway, wearing comfortable casual clothes, was the man from the videotape, his face lined with deep wrinkles. But the cold, emotionless eyes were entirely identical to the monster I had watched on the screen. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, his deep voice carrying a note of polite irritation. "It is incredibly late." "I apologize for the intrusion, sir," I replied smoothly, projecting my most professional, authoritative dispatch voice. "I am a supervisor with the municipal utility company. We are tracking a massive, localized surge in the underground copper telephone lines routing through this specific block. It is creating a severe fire hazard. I need to briefly inspect the primary connection junction inside your home." The man frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I have not experienced any issues with my landline." "The surge is silent, sir," I countered, maintaining eye contact. "If the copper wiring in your walls overheats, the insulation will ignite entirely within the drywall. The inspection will take less than 2 minutes." The threat of municipal inconvenience easily bypassed his strict paranoia. He sighed heavily and pulled the door open. I walked down the hallway, highly aware of the killer standing near the front door behind me. I opened the door to the small utility closet and stepped inside. After a moment, I spotted a cordless landline receiver resting in its charging cradle. On a small wooden table just outside the utility closet, I picked up the plastic handset, pressed the green connection button, and brought the speaker to my ear. A heavy, suffocating static hissed through the tiny speaker, followed immediately by a sharp, wet sound. Click, click, click. I carefully set the receiver down on the flat surface of the wooden table and left the line open. I walked back down the hallway to the entryway. The junction is experiencing a severe frequency loop, I informed him, offering a polite, practiced nod. I have left your landline receiver off the hook to maintain the active signal. You must leave that line completely open until tomorrow morning. Do not hang up that phone, under any circumstances. Just make sure the gate is closed on your way out, the killer muttered. I walked down the steps, rounded the corner, and reached my parked car. I drove away from the suburbs, heading back toward the safety of my own apartment. I spent the entire night sitting awake on my sofa, staring at the walls, listening intently for the sound of wet flesh and scraping stones. The apartment remained completely silent. The following morning, I turned on the local news station while I drank my coffee. The lead anchor appeared on the screen, his expression somber, as he reported breaking news from the western suburbs. The authorities had discovered the body of a retired, highly decorated border enforcement official inside his home early this morning. The anchor stated that the scene was incredibly chaotic and violent, completely baffling the forensic teams. The official cause of death was currently withheld from the public, but anonymous sources within the precinct indicated the victim had been brutally mangled, his limbs heavily lacerated and violently bound together by hundreds of yards of thick, rusted copper telephone wire. I turned the television off and set my coffee mug down on the table. I am posting this account here today to document the events of the last 48 hours. I returned to the dispatch center for my shift tonight. The sticky note is still sitting in the trash can under my desk. I firmly believe the entity has finally left me alone. It followed the signal. It found the monster responsible for the atrocities, and it extracted its terrible revenge. The connection has been permanently severed. I just desperately hope the phone on my desk never clicks again.